The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at her thin shawl as she stumbled through the whiteout. She could barely see the porch steps ahead, let alone the man waiting with a shotgun trembling in his frost-bitten hands. "Don't come any closer," he shouted, voice raw from grief and cold. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not when she saw the tiny, shivering faces peeking out from behind his legs. 2 children, barefoot on the splintered floor, their faces hollow with hunger. She dropped to her knees in the snow, arms stretched out, as if offering her very soul to a man who had forgotten how to hope. "I'm not here to take anything," she cried through the storm. "I came to give you everything I have." The shotgun barrel lowered an inch. The children's eyes widened, and somewhere behind them, in that broken, bitter house, a new chapter of their lives was quietly waiting to be written. Subscribe now, because tomorrow's story will haunt you even deeper. You'll need it. But before that, let me take you to the day it all began. Dust rolled down the main street of Clearwater like smoke from a dying fire. The town was little more than a scattering of weather-beaten buildings and a church steeple that pointed accusingly at the heavens. Horses kicked up plumes of dirt with every sluggish step, and the heat of late autumn clung to everything like a fever that wouldn't break. She walked alone, as always. Clara's boots scuffed softly against the cracked boardwalk, the hem of her plain brown dress swishing around her ankles. She kept her head low, bonnet pulled tight around her face, trying and failing to disappear into the background. No one greeted her. No one smiled. They never did. The whispers were like smoke too, seeping through every crack in the dusty silence. "That's her, the one who answered a husband and got left before the wedding. I heard she's cursed. Brings bad luck wherever she goes. Saw that limp she's got. Looks like she's dragging death behind her." Clara clenched her hands inside her worn gloves and pressed on, feeling every gaze like a thorn against her skin. The limp was real. She had fallen from a horse years ago, back when she still had something resembling a life, a family, a future. The injury never quite healed, and now she walked with a slight drag to her right foot, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let her go. But the limp wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the silence. Born nearly deaf after a fever as a child, Clara lived in a world muffled and muted, where conversations slipped away before she could catch them, where laughter and love were sounds she remembered more than experienced. People didn't understand, and what they didn't understand, they feared, or worse, pitied. She hated the pity most of all. The post office was her first stop, as it was every Wednesday. The same old hope bloomed painfully in her chest as she stepped inside, the hope that maybe this time there would be a letter. Maybe this time her mail order application would be answered. Maybe there was a man somewhere who didn't mind a broken woman. But the box was empty, as always. The postmaster didn't even look up from his newspaper. Clara's throat tightened. She swallowed hard and turned to leave, but a small scrap of conversation floated to her, barely audible but enough. "Blizzard's coming early this year. Up north, they say it's already started." Her heart skipped. Her sister, married and living far to the north, had written to her weeks ago, warning about the brutal winters there. She had begged Clara to come visit before the first snows, but Clara hadn't had the courage, or the means. Outside, the sky already wore the heavy gray of an impending storm. She walked home slowly, past the mercantile where the owner's wife yanked her son indoors at the sight of her, past the blacksmith who spat in the dirt when she passed. Each movement, each gesture, was a reminder. She didn't belong here. Hadn't since the accident, hadn't since the whispers started, hadn't since she became the cursed one. Home was a one-room cabin at the very edge of Clearwater, crouched between 2 dying trees. It wasn't much, but it was hers, or at least it had been. The last notice from the landlord had been clear. If she couldn't pay by month's end, she'd be out. She opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of cold ash and old paper. The few belongings she had were neatly stacked: a thin mattress, a cracked wash basin, a handful of books with fraying covers. She sat by the window, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and stared out at the dying light. For a long time she didn't move. She just sat there, letting the emptiness fill her up until there was no room left for anything else. No friends. No family close enough to reach. Only whispers behind her back, only silence in her ears. A scrap of newspaper sat on the table, folded to the advertisement section. Her eyes drifted to it. Wanted. Strong, kind woman to help raise 2 children. Harsh winters. Remote land. Marriage offered. God-fearing essential. The ad was old, maybe months, probably filled. Still something tugged at her. A chance. A reason to leave this place that had already buried her while she still breathed. She picked up a pencil and with a trembling hand, began to write. My name is Clara Hayes. I am a good woman, I can work hard, and I know how to survive harsh winters. I would be honored to be considered. Her letter was simple, like her life. No mention of her limp, no mention of the deafness, no mention of the scars that were not always visible but ran deep. Just the truth. She had nothing left to lose. As she folded the letter, she paused, staring at the paper with an ache in her chest. Somewhere, far away, a storm was already rising. And somewhere, far away, a man she had never met was about to change her life forever. If this is breaking your heart already, you haven't seen the worst yet. Tap subscribe. I've got another truth waiting for you tomorrow. She slipped the letter into her satchel and headed back toward the post office, shoulders square, heart bruised but stubborn. The first snowflakes began to fall as she closed, her door behind her. Silent, soft, and full of promise. And somewhere across the wild north, a widowed farmer fighting ghosts of his own unknowingly waited for the woman who would walk through a blizzard just to save him. The wind carried a different, kind of cold the next morning, sharp, whispering, restless. Clara felt it as she stepped out of the post office, a strange energy stirring in the air, setting her nerves on edge. She clutched a folded piece of paper in her hand. A reply. It had come. Need help before winter traps us. Will pay for travel. Marriage can wait until you decide. Children need a mother. There was no signature, only an address scrawled below in a rough, hurried hand. Clearwater's postmaster had barely glanced at her when he handed it over, but she caught the thin curl of disdain on his lip. They all thought they knew her story. But Clara had learned long ago. Most folks only saw what they wanted to see. She spent the afternoon packing her few belongings, heart pounding, hands trembling. By evening, a neighbor's wagon was heading north, and Clara sat stiffly on a pile of wool bales, the letter pressed close to her chest, as the town of Clearwater disappeared behind her in a haze of dust and regret. The storm hit 3 days into the journey. Thick snow swallowed the world, howling through the trees and across the frozen fields. The wagon could go no farther. Clara stumbled through drifts up to her knees, the address clutched in her numbing hand. A house finally emerged from the white, a crumbling 2-story structure barely standing against the gale. Smoke struggled from a broken chimney. The porch sagged. Window shutters banged against the walls like the desperate hands of a trapped soul. She barely made it to the porch before she collapsed. The door slammed open. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, rough-edged. His hair was dark, wild from the wind, and his face was hard, set in lines that spoke of loss, not anger. He raised a shotgun instinctively, stepping between her and the doorway. Clara struggled to her knees, forcing her frozen mouth to form the words. Clara. You wrote me. His eyes narrowed, scanning her face, her trembling form. His gaze dropped to the letter still clutched in her hand. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, very slowly, he lowered the gun. The children appeared behind him, a boy maybe 8, and a little girl so small she was still clutching a ragged cloth doll. Their faces were hollow, wary, curious. Clara tried to smile. It came out more like a grimace. The man stepped aside, gruffly waving her in. Inside, the house was as broken as it looked, drafts snaking through every crack, soot smudging the walls, the smell of wood smoke and desperation thick in the air. A few battered chairs circled the fire, and a threadbare quilt lay abandoned on the floor. He didn't offer a name. He didn't offer help as she shrugged off her snow-caked coat and hobbled forward, dragging her limp leg behind her, but he didn't turn her away either. Sometimes that was enough. For days, they barely spoke. Clara worked, sewing torn clothes, patching leaks, cooking thin soups from dwindling supplies. The man, Samuel, as she finally overheard one of the children whisper, spent most of his time outside, battling the snow, to keep the livestock alive and the roof from caving in. In the quiet moments, Clara sat with the children, teaching them simple signs to bridge the silence. At first, they were hesitant, staring at her as if she were some strange creature. But children, unlike adults, had open hearts. Curiosity won out over fear. It started with a single moment. One night, Clara was darning a sock by the fire when the little girl, Lucy, toddled over, plopped into her lap, and fell asleep. Clara froze, staring down at the small, trusting body curled against her. When she looked up, Samuel was watching from the doorway. Their eyes met, an unspoken truce forming in the glow of the firelight. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and turned away. The town nearest Samuel's farm was even smaller than Clearwater, just a few scattered buildings and a tavern that doubled as a general store. Supplies were low. Suspicion was high. When Samuel took Clara with him one day to buy flour and salt, the stares were immediate. "That's the deaf one from Clearwater," a man muttered too loudly. "Figures Sam would bring in someone broken. Matches his luck," another sneered. Clara kept her chin up, refusing to shrink. She didn't need their approval. She wasn't here for them. Samuel said nothing, but his hand, rough and calloused, brushed lightly against her elbow as they passed through the store. It wasn't affection exactly, more like assurance, a silent promise that for now she was safe. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, Clara caught sight of a man watching from across the street, tall, lean, with a predatory gleam in his eye. Not a stranger to violence, she thought instinctively. Trouble. Samuel must have seen her stiffen, because he muttered under his breath, "Stay close." Something about the way he said it made her heart thud against her ribs. There were dangers out here far worse than a blizzard. What if someone saw you for who you are, not what you carry? Subscribe. One day that story might be yours too. The days grew shorter, the cold bit harder. Yet inside the battered walls of Samuel's house, something was shifting. Small things. A second spoon set out for her at meals. A rough scarf left on her chair, hand-knitted with clumsy stitches. A moment when Samuel caught her stumbling on the icy steps and instinctively caught her, his hands firm, his eyes startled, as if he hadn't realized he could still feel something. Tension hung between them, not sharp, not painful, but heavy with possibilities. Some nights when the children were asleep, they sat by the fire, sharing the kind of silence that felt fuller than any conversation. Clara would sew or mend, and Samuel would carve small toys from scraps of wood, tiny horses, crude little sleds. He never asked about her limp. He never asked about the hearing loss. He treated her like she was simply herself. And in that quiet, broken house beneath the howl of the endless storm, Clara dared to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't cursed after all. Maybe she was exactly where she was meant to be. But outside, in the frozen woods, danger was still stirring, and soon, their fragile peace would be shattered in ways none of them could yet imagine. The storm outside had eased, but inside Clara's heart, a different tempest was brewing. Trust was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice that could shatter under the slightest misstep, and missteps, in a town like this, were inevitable. It began the night Samuel needed supplies and stayed in town longer than usual, leaving Clara and the children behind. The knock came after sunset, sharp, urgent. Lucy stirred in her sleep. The boy, Thomas, tensed beside her. Clara hesitated. No one came out this far unless they had a reason. She cracked the door open a few inches and immediately regretted it. It was the man she had seen in town before, the one with the predator's smile. He leaned against the doorframe, boots caked, in snow, a bottle of whiskey swinging from one hand. "Well, well," he slurred, eyes raking over her. "Heard Samuel took in some charity case. Figured I'd come see for myself." Clara moved to shut the door, but he wedged his boot inside. With a cruel grin, "Don't be shy, darlin'. Ain't nobody gonna want you when he's through. Might as well be friendly." The words, the insinuation, sliced through her like cold steel. She shoved against the door with all her strength, but he was bigger, meaner. The wood creaked under his weight. Then Thomas, small and fierce, grabbed the iron poker from the hearth and jabbed it at the man's leg. The stranger yelped and stumbled back, cursing violently. It was enough. Clara slammed the door, throwing the bolt just as he lunged again. Through the cracks, she heard him spitting threats into the snow. "Won't be no one left to help you when winter's done, you hear me?" No one. The words clung to her like frostbite. When Samuel returned hours later, Clara didn't tell him. How could she? What if he sent her away for bringing trouble to his doorstep? So she stayed silent. She stitched her heart up tighter. She pretended. But the silence grew heavy, suffocating. Whispers followed her in town. Snickers, sidelong glances. The lie they painted was easy to believe. That Clara was desperate, untrustworthy, a burden. When Samuel asked what was wrong, she shook her head and smiled, and so the distance between them grew. The final blow came days later at the trading post. They needed flour. Samuel said he'd come after tending the horses, so Clara went ahead with the children, bundling them up against the bitter cold. The store was crowded with local farmers, traders, and him. The man from that night. He tipped his hat mockingly when he saw her, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Well, if it ain't Sammy's little cripple." Laughter rippled through the room. Clara froze, the sack of flour slipping from her fingers and spilling in a cloud of white dust. Someone muttered, "Poor thing. Samuel's just too lonely to be choosy." Another added, "Don't need good ears to be a good wife, eh?" Clara's face burned. Her hands shook. Lucy clutched her leg, confused. Thomas squared his tiny shoulders, trying to look brave. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't move. When Samuel finally pushed through the door, his face hardened instantly at the scene before him. But Clara didn't wait to see what he would do. She grabbed the children and fled into the snow. She didn't know where she was. Running. Only that she needed to get away from the stares, the pity, the humiliation. The storm was starting again, the sky dark and heavy. The road blurred before her. The cold bit at her lungs with every breath. Her limp slowed her. Thomas kept pace as best he could, holding Lucy's hand. But soon the children began to stumble too. Clara dropped to her knees in the snow, gasping. It was too much. All of it. The stares, the silence, the endless loneliness. A part of her wanted to lie down and let the snow cover her. Maybe then they'd finally stop looking at her like she was broken. She buried her face in her hands, tears freezing on her lashes. She didn't hear the footsteps, crunching toward her. She didn't hear Samuel's voice, rough with fear, calling her name, but she felt the warmth of a coat draped over her shoulders, felt strong hands lifting Lucy and Thomas into his arms, felt the steady presence of him kneeling in the snow beside her, not demanding, not judging, just there. Clara lifted her head. Samuel's face was etched with something she hadn't seen before, something raw and furious and heartbreakingly kind. "I'm sorry," she rasped, hating how broken she sounded. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head, cutting her off. "You don't owe anyone anything," he said roughly. "Not them. Not me." She stared at him, trying to read the truth in his eyes. "You deserved better," he said simply. "Not you need to be better. Not you should have been stronger. You deserved better." Clara crumpled, the last of her strength giving way. But Samuel caught her, steadying her, not holding her captive but standing with her, shoulder to shoulder, like a man who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. They stayed there in the falling snow, a small broken family clinging together against the cold, and for the first time in years, Clara felt something flicker to life in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the first fragile, stubborn breath of it. They thought she was broken, but someone saw gold in the ashes. Subscribe. I promise. Tomorrow's story will prove love still lives out here. Samuel carried the children back to the wagon, wrapped them in blankets, and guided Clara inside. They didn't speak much on the ride home. The words didn't matter. His presence said everything. Later that night, sitting by the fire, Clara found the courage to speak the question gnawing at her soul. "Why did you answer my letter?" she asked quietly. Samuel didn't look away from the flames. "Because I was tired of pretending I didn't need saving too." Clara blinked, stunned. He turned to her then, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I didn't need perfect," he said. "I needed real." The room fell into a deep, warm silence. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, Clara felt the first stirrings of something she had thought lost forever. Belonging. Maybe not a fairy tale, maybe not the perfect life she once dreamed of, but something better. Something true. The storm lasted for 3 more days. 3 days of huddling close, rationing food, stoking the fire until the last log burned to embers. 3 days of quiet looks, of children's laughter peeking through the cracks of a battered house. 3 days of a slow, stubborn kind of healing. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, everything had changed. Samuel found her by the broken fence that morning, hammering, nails with clumsy, determined strokes. "You're supposed to rest," he said gruffly. Clara glanced over her shoulder, breath frosting in the cold air. "Tired of resting." He didn't smile, but the corners of his mouth twitched. Without a word, he grabbed another hammer and began working. Beside her, the fence wasn't just wood and nails, it was a defiance, a reclamation. Against the cold, against judgment, against all the voices that had said you're not enough. Together they rebuilt it post by post. When the last board was nailed, Samuel leaned on the fence and looked at her. "We could make something here," he said simply. Clara wiped sweat and sawdust from her brow, heart pounding. She hadn't realized how badly she wanted that. A place that was hers. A place where she wasn't a burden. Where she was needed. A home. Spring crept over the land in slow, tentative steps. The snow melted into rivers that fed the earth, and with it Samuel and Clara began to build something more. They planted a garden, patched the roof, mended the barn where an old mare was heavy with foal. Every day Clara found herself moving, a little easier, smiling a little more. Every day she felt the fire inside her, long dormant, begin to flicker and grow. But not everyone was willing to let the past die quietly. It happened on a warm afternoon. Just as the first blossoms unfurled on the apple tree behind the house, the sheriff came. He rode up with a grim face, flanked by 2 deputies, dust rising from their horses' hooves. Samuel stepped onto the porch, shotgun cradled loosely in his arms, not in threat, but in warning. Clara stood behind him, Lucy clinging to her skirts, Thomas tense at her side. The sheriff spat into the dirt and tipped his hat. "We had a complaint." Samuel's voice was low and flat. "About what?" The sheriff shrugged, feigning indifference. "About a woman with no right to be here. About stolen charity." His eyes flicked to Clara, cold and calculating. "You know the laws, Sam. Mail-order brides ain't supposed to come out without proper papers. No marriage license, no rights." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Papers. She had the letter, but not a license. She had been too desperate, too broken to think of legalities. And now, that mistake could tear everything apart. Samuel's hand flexed on the shotgun. "She's not a thief. Law says she is." The sheriff's smile was thin. "And the children ain't hers either. Could get real messy if folks started talking." Clara's chest tightened until she could barely breathe. She had known this happiness was too fragile to last. She had known it. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't run this time, not from this. Samuel stepped forward, voice steady as bedrock. "Then we'll fix it." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You proposing?" Samuel turned, met Clara's eyes. Not a grand gesture, not a desperate plea. Just a steady, honest question in his gaze. "Will you stand with me?" Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Samuel faced the sheriff again. "Get the papers, we'll sign 'em." The sheriff sneered but swung his horse around. "Don't take too long, folks are watching." When the lawman rode off, Samuel turned to Clara. "I'm not doing this to save face," he said, voice rough. "I'm doing it because I want you here, with me. Them kids too." Clara swallowed hard. "I know," she whispered, and she did. In his quiet, stubborn way, Samuel had always been choosing her. Not because she was perfect, but because she was herself. Tension peak. Insert, "You've come this far with her." You felt that, didn't you? Subscribe. I want you to meet someone else tomorrow. Someone just as forgotten. The wedding was small. Just Samuel, Clara, the children, and a grumbling pastor who kept checking his pocket watch. The ring Samuel slipped onto her finger was plain, scratched, worn, but it was more precious than any gold band Clara had ever dreamed of as a girl. It meant something real. When he kissed her, it wasn't tentative. It wasn't fiery. It was home. But life doesn't smooth out overnight. Trouble still simmered in town. Old grudges, small minds, whispers that Clara had bewitched Samuel, that she was using him. Clara heard them, sharp as stones thrown at her back, and still she stayed, because this time she had a place, a family, and because Samuel stood beside her, unshakable as the mountains. They worked the land through blistering summers and brutal winters. Samuel taught Thomas how to drive nails and mend fences. Clara taught Lucy how to plant seeds and tie ribbons in her hair. And at night, when the world went quiet, Samuel and Clara sat by the fire, the kind of silence between them that only people who had bled and survived together could share. The final challenge came not from outside, but within. One night, long after the children had gone to bed, Clara found Samuel sitting alone, shoulders slumped, a bottle of whiskey unopened at his side. The letter lay in his lap, the one he had written to her so long ago. "I didn't write it right," he said, without looking up. His voice was rough, torn. "Didn't tell you everything." Clara sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. He stared into the fire. "I didn't just lose my wife," he said. "I lost myself. Thought if I found someone, I could fix it, could fix me." Clara's heart ached at the rawness in his words. "But you didn't fix me," he whispered. "You made me stop needing to be fixed." Tears burned her eyes. "I was so scared you'd see how broken I was," he admitted. Clara reached out, turned his face to hers. "I did see," she said softly. "And I stayed." In the firelight, Samuel closed his eyes, resting his forehead against hers. Not saved, not fixed, simply seen and loved anyway.